I'm going to tell you about some of the research that I've done on the importance of diagram design in biology education. So I thought I would start, since we're interested in science instruction, with a quote from the National Science Foundation, and that on one of the pages of their website, they wrote, "Some of science's most powerful statements are not made in words. To illustrate is to enlighten." There are a lot of different kinds of illustrations or visualizations. The particular, and the other presenters here will talk about various ones as well. I'm particularly interested in diagrams. We know that diagrams are critical tools for learning, for reasoning about, for communicating scientific structures, scientific processes, scientific relationships. And a lot of research from cognitive science provides a number of reasons why diagrams are such important tools. So one reason is that they simplify complex situations. A second is that they make abstract concepts more concrete. And a third is that they substitute easier perceptual inferences for more computationally intensive, more difficult search processes and verbal deductive inferences. And the hypothesis that I've really been looking at in a lot of my research is that how diagrams are constructed, how they're designed, affects students' understanding of them. That, in particular, the structure of a diagram, independent of the content that's represented in that diagram, carries meaning. So by saying that the structure and the content, at least to some extent, have independent effects, this means that the structure by itself can either reinforce or conflict with the correct interpretation of the diagram that you want the student to have. And so I'm going to try to show you in the studies I'm going to tell you about that there is this independence, that the structure is important, and moreover that these effects are remarkably stable across levels of expertise or levels of background knowledge. And so the primary goal of my talk today then really is to convince you that diagram design matters, and that therefore it has to be front and center in your thinking when you're creating diagrams for instructional purposes. So I'm going to tell you about, very briefly, a number of studies. I figured since this is a talk on visualizations, I would give you a visual outline of my presentation rather than a set of bullet points. So the research that I've been doing has been looking at students' understandings of diagrammatic depictions of evolutionary history, of evolutionary relationships among a variety of taxa. So in the first experiment, I'm going to talk about interpretations of diagrams that present linear versus branching depictions of evolutionary history. In the second experiment, I'm going to focus on just branching diagrams and compare whether that branching structure is represented in a diagonal or a rectangular format. And then the final two studies are going to look at just the rectangular format. And what we did in those studies was to manipulate how the branches are rotated, which then can be used to place a particular focal taxon either at one end of the diagram or embedded in the middle. And we'll look at effects of that. All right, so to start with, we have linear versus branching depictions of evolutionary history. So the depictions at the top of this diagram have some branching, but they also have some linear components. For example, from Merychippus here to Pliohippus to Equus, from Homo habilis to Homo erectus to Homo sapiens, whereas the ones on the bottom are completely branching diagrams. And we were interested here in students' interpretations of speciation. And our hypothesis was that diagrams like those on the top, which incidentally we took from textbooks, that diagrams with linear depictions would lead students to make transformational explanations of speciation, which are incorrect. So for example, they would say things like, Merychippus evolves into Pliohippus, which becomes equus over time, or Homo habilis turns into Homo erectus, which becomes Homo sapiens, yay. And that isn't, those are incorrect interpretations of speciation, whereas in contrast, we hypothesized that if you have completely branching diagrams, that would lead to explanations in terms of splitting or common ancestry, which are the correct interpretation. So in this study, we had 104 college students with stronger versus weaker backgrounds in biology, which is based on the number of college courses they had taken. They received one horse diagram, one hominid diagram. They were asked 3 or 4 questions about the evolutionary relationships depicted in these diagrams. We coded their written responses, and I'm going to talk about just one dependent measure from this study in the interest of time, which is the proportion of questions for which students talked about transformation, for which they were incorrect. And you can see in the graph here that whether we had diagrams depicting hominid evolution or horse evolution, when those diagrams had linear components, students were much more likely to provide these incorrect transformational explanations of speciation than when we gave them branching diagrams. In fact, with branching diagrams, these transformational explanations are almost eliminated. Right. So the next study, we said, okay, let's focus on these branching diagrams. And there are 2 different formats. If you look in the primary literature in biology, there are 2 different formats for presenting these branching depictions, a rectangular format and a diagonal format. These 2 formats are structurally equivalent. They're isomorphic, so you can, if you look on the rectangular format on the left, you can see that lizards and snakes form this group that joins first. You see the same thing in the diagonal format. The lizard-snake group then joins with birds, which again you can see in the diagonal format. The carnivores and rodents form what's called a sister group, which you can see in the diagonal format, and then the lizard-snake-bird group joins with carnivores and rodents, and that happens in both cases. We hypothesized, however, that because of the Gestalt principle of good continuation, which says that a continuous line is a single entity, so here's a nice continuous line in the diagonal format, that this would interfere with students' ability to extract the hierarchical relationships, because this continuous line here in the diagonal format looks like a single hierarchical level, but really it's 3 if you look at the rectangular format. So there's one at the bottom, and then one here, and then one up here finally at the rodents. And we had some initial research that showed, in fact, that this principle of good continuation does, in fact, interfere with students' ability to extract the hierarchical structure. So the study I want to tell you about, we further hypothesized, well, if it's difficult for students to extract the hierarchical structure, it's going to make it hard for them to understand the evolutionary relationships that are depicted. So in this study, again, we had college students with either weaker or stronger backgrounds in biology. Very briefly, we gave a list of courses, college courses that were basic biology courses, and then courses like evolution and genetics and organismal level classes where they might be expected to learn about or to encounter evolutionary trees. So the weaker background students had taken between 0 and 2 of these courses with an average of just over half a semester course. The stronger background students had taken between 3 and 7 of these courses, on average about 4.5 semesters. So there's a really big difference in biology background. The students received 4 diagrams in a rectangular format, 4 in a diagonal format. We asked them a variety of relationship and inference questions about the information depicted in these diagrams. So for example, this is for the rectangular format diagram at the top. We asked, which taxon, dragonfly or butterfly, is the closest evolutionary relation to the walking stick? The correct answer is the butterfly, because it shares a more recent common ancestor with the walking stick, which is right here, then does the dragonfly, whose most recent common ancestor is all the way down here. So we asked a question that had a set answer, and then we asked students to provide an explanation, which we coded. Okay, so the results are shown here. So these are average scores for both accuracy and explanation quality, and you can see whether we look at the students with weaker backgrounds who are on the left or students with stronger backgrounds in biology who are on the right, whether we look at their performance on the accuracy measure or we look at performance on the explanation quality measure, students did better across the board when the evolutionary relationships were depicted in the rectangular format than when they were depicted in the diagonal format. Weaker and stronger, accuracy and explanation quality. So finally then, we said, okay, let's look at just the rectangular format. And then what we did here was looked at how these branches are rotated. So these, this particular type of evolutionary diagram is called a cladogram. It's basically a mobile. Hang it upside down and the branches rotate, and that doesn't change the hierarchical structure, but it does change the locations of the taxa. And that's what we manipulated. And so I have highlighted with arrows here a particular focal taxon. So if we look at the two vertically oriented cladograms on the left, you can see in the top one we've got human at the top, and underneath in this one here we have human in the middle. But these two cladograms are identical. They show the same set of relationships. All I did was take the cladogram at this point and just rotate that branch. It changes where it makes human at the top and salamander in the middle, or the other way around, salamander at the top and human in the middle, but it doesn't change the structure of the relationships. So we did this manipulation with these vertically oriented cladograms. We also did it with horizontally oriented cladograms. All I'm showing you is the one example with human at the right, but you do the same rotation and human goes in the middle. And then we did the same thing with this other cladogram where our focal taxon is honeybee. And so I've just showed you the case where honeybee is in the middle, but you can rotate it and make the honeybee on the right. And we did this because there's a lot of cognitive research showing that the end of a series is salient. The top or the right is an important location. We put the best things at the top or at the right. Not this stuff in the middle, just forget the stuff in the middle. So we had two studies here, basically the same study with two different populations. So experiment 3, we had 69 undergraduates. Experiment 4, we had 33 10th graders. And so the beginning, we showed them these cladograms. We started with an orienting question whose purpose was really just to direct their attention to the focal taxon. So we know that they've looked at this diagram, they've paid attention to where things are. So basically ensured that we had the manipulation that we intended. And then the critical question for this particular study was which taxon or taxa is or are most highly evolved. The correct answer is this is a meaningless question, and basically nobody said that, but we were interested in what kinds of mistakes do they make? Do they mention the focal taxon, and does that vary as a function of how we rotated the branches? And the answer is yes. So you can see on the left for the college students, on the right for the high school students, the same pattern of results. So this is the proportion of students who listed the focal taxon, either the honeybee or the human, as the most highly evolved taxon. And you can see that when that taxon was in the end position, which is the yellow bars, students were much more likely to say that it was most highly evolved than when it was embedded in the center. That's the case for college students and high school students. More likely for human than honeybee, obviously. So for the case when they said the human, we went up, well, in all cases, we asked them to explain their answer. We coded their explanations when they answered human, and I'm just going to talk about the case where whether they mentioned the location as an explanation, And you can see for both the undergraduates and the high school students, when human was at the end, either the top or the right, half of them gave that as their explanation. When the human was in the center, only 15% said that was the reason. So diagrams are important carriers of meaning in STEM fields. What I hope I've convinced you of today is that meaning is conveyed both not just by the content that's represented, but also by the structure of the diagram. That means that we have to consider the inferences that students will make based on diagram structure, and we need to teach students how to interpret diagrams, which I know is part of what was happening with the Center Grant. So we need to tell them the meaning that was conveyed by various design elements and which design elements don't convey meaning, like the position in the cladogram. All right, so curriculum designers need to pay as much attention to how relationships are diagrammatically as to how those supporting concepts are described verbally. And I won't list everybody here, but I do want to thank IES for my funding for the last 4 years or so, and Kevin Catley, my colleague in the biology department at Western Carolina University. And I had this slide, but I guess we're not doing questions now. We're going to do questions at the end.
Yeah.
Okay.